listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, the place to learn about new technology and technological advances before they become mainstream. This podcast is sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. It's not about the destination. It's about going someplace you never thought possible. Go to imaginenext.ingrammicro.com to find out more. Let's get into it.
Welcome to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. I'm your host, Shelby Skrhak, and our guest today is Will Berardelli, Partners Development Specialist for VMware. Will, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really excited.
Absolutely. Well, today we are talking about how VMware Carbon Black is helping modernize the Security Operations Center, or a SOC. But like we can normally do, let's get some context then. So we're talking about VMware's Carbon Black. Just tell us what Carbon Black is.
Yeah, so Carbon Black was a company we were originally founded in 2002. And one of our founders was actually working on a contract with the federal government. And he was a really good ethical hacker. His name was Mike Viscuso. And so during that time, they contracted him to say, hey, how can you get into our environment and do some ethical hacking? They wanted him to basically hack their environment to understand what gaps they had. Mm-hmm. And so what he quickly found was that he was able to get it, not only get into the environment, and when they did find him, they would kick him out, but he would use the same doors and the same exploits that he'd used previously to get right back in. So they, even though they were able to find him in some cases, they would kick him out and he would just get right back in, kind of like a revolving door. So they set out and they said, how do we solve this problem, right? How do we create some sort of software to really develop and understand, how to prevent this from happening? And so with that, that's how really Carbon Black was started. It's come a long way. There's been a lot of different things that we've done since that time. But one of the foundational components that was the endpoint detection and response piece, or EDR. And we were the first company to come to market with an endpoint detection and response tool. And with that, what it does is basically it's an easy way to look at it is it's a security camera for your endpoint. So then they were able to really provide that context into how, why, what was happening, and then kind of plug the holes from there. So they had more visibility and the ability to actually proactively threat hunt, which is actually what we called the product for a while was Carbon Black Threat Hunter. It's since been renamed to Enterprise EDR, but that was really the start. And so since then, we've really had a strong focus, Carbon Black specifically, on endpoint security. How protect end users' devices, as well as servers that are out there, and stop encryption attacks from happening. And it's been developed, and there's a lot of things that have been added onto the solution since then. But really, that's been the focus there, and that's the kind of the quick starting story there.
Yeah. Well, I like that analogy, kind of like a security camera for your endpoint. And that's the thing. I mean, with the pandemic and COVID and everybody kind of working from home, it used to be you could protect your area virtually with a virtual perimeter, I guess. But when the perimeter came a whole lot bigger, I imagine that kept some security professionals and technology leaders up at night. So, of course, the Security Operations Center, can help to allay some of those fears and put a team together. But when we're looking at the context of modernizing that, we hear the phrase that complexity is the enemy of security. But what does that mean, really?
Definitely, yeah. And I think you started to address it there with talking about, some of the big shifts that we saw with the pandemic and COVID hitting. And even before then, right, I think COVID really accelerated it. But what we started to see is some of the bigger trends were, people working from home and the adoption of cloud technology. And those two things go hand in hand. And so, what that does is it's difficult because a lot of times when you look at security, it's oftentimes bolted on and it's kind of an afterthought. And there's this graphic that I always think of. It's a cartoon image that's been out there for a while, but it's a CISO who's sitting at the kids' table and some of the executives tap him on the shoulder and they say, hey, it's time for you to come eat dinner with us and move over to the big table. Yeah. And that's really, we've seen that graphic's pretty old now, but I always think about it, it's just become more and more relevant. And so when we say complexity, we're talking about how the attack perimeter has really grown and shifted, right? And so that we started to see that adoption, and a lot of security companies were already telling that story of, hey, like, how are you protecting? And that was already a common problem before the pandemic of how are you protecting, cloud applications, and how are you, with your employees having more accessibility to applications, how are you really securing that? And with security, a lot of times being an afterthought is, hey, let's build it first. Let's build the infrastructure, and then let's bolt it on. So that's really then that's where the complexity is created is now how do you go in and how do you secure all of those different things? Which has created a lot of different challenges. And, I think of a lot of times of an apartment complex where, I live in Boston and there's a lot of old houses that have been around for hundreds of years. And so when you walk by some of these, you see all these things that are just bolted on and added to them to make them, adequate to the regulations that are happening. And so you'll see, a fire escape that's been attached because they didn't originally install exits. Now there's codes around building laws that you have to have that. You see the air conditioner not being built in when the houses were first built. They didn't have air conditioners.
Right, of course.
Yeah. Cool in the hot summer, you have to go and add your AC unit into the window. And so one of the things that VMware is doing is really building that from the inside out, right? Where you're building your infrastructure, whether it be on-prem or cloud, we're able to add the security layer into that as we're building it out. So it's kind of like a one-stop shop where as you're expanding and you're growing that remote workforce, we're adding that security, that piece into it as you're expanding.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the security challenges that companies are facing. I mean, what are those, if you were to enumerate some of those key challenges, what are you typically seeing?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, with the work from home piece, people just needing to have access and COVID really accelerating that accessibility that end users needed. And I actually have a funny quick story about not too long ago. I was working. It was a Sunday night. It was we had a holiday weekend. So Monday we had off. And so, I was out with some friends. We were having a great time. We rented an Airbnb out in Rhode Island and we're having a blast. And so we went out to dinner that night. And we actually had one of the partners that I support reached out and I said, hey, Will, there's this really severe ransomware attack that's happening right now. And that's what we see a lot with the bad guys is they'll wait until, everybody's out of office a Sunday before a holiday.
Yeah.
They just know that that's when there's going to be less accessibility. And so at that moment, they said, hey, we need additional support from your team. Can you help? And I was like, yes, of course. And it was just one of these really cool moments where I kind of saw the full life cycle of VMware, where I came in and I needed to get access to our Salesforce. And I needed to basically help them kind of move this and get them the proper resources assigned. And I needed to do it from my cell phone. I was out at the bar when I got the call.
Right.
How do I help these guys? So
Yeah.
we have with VMware, one of the amazing products they have is Workspace ONE. And so it gives you this, it has a single sign-on portal and we apply multi-factor authentication to that for extra security parameters around that. But I was able to very quickly, from a crowded bar in Rhode Island, probably an hour drive back to the Airbnb to get all the things that, my laptop and all of that, was able to quickly get those resources assigned. And we ended up, helping our client at the time go and defend against a live ransomware attack. But yeah, so that's a piece of, the expanded, people need accessibility to applications. They need them at weird times. You need them at 9:00 at night on a Sunday before a holiday. And so that's just one of the challenges, though, is with security has always been, how do you create security and convenience? And security is a lot of times just inherently inconvenient. And it doesn't have to be, but a lot of times it is, especially when you're bolting things on. And, one of the examples I use is, just walking into your apartment, your house. If it's very easy for you to get in the front door, if you don't lock it, it's also very easy for the bad guys to get in if you're not locking it up either. So how do you figure out a way to, have your keys on you and make sure that nobody else is going to get those keys, and then applying that same fundamental principle to the cyber world. And that's, some of the things that we're addressing here.
That is the age-old conundrum there that, you need to be able to lock the door against the bad guys. And, one lock is good, 2 locks, 3 locks, maybe you do a whole, a whole booby trap system for this, this analogy of a house that we're talking about. But then what happens when the owners try to get in? They're stepping through this and that. And I guess that's where either the laxity or kind of this idea that, well, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure nothing's going to happen. That's probably the kiss of death, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And, in that same analogy of the house, with all these different users coming in with different devices and all the different surfaces that are needed to protect people working from, tablets, cell phones, all those different points of accessibility. And the example of that house or that apartment, you've now just opened up, you have 7 more doors to lock now. And how are you locking those doors? And, it used to be, maybe it was just one door that you had to lock, but now you have to make sure, before you go to bed at night, everything's kind of doing that. And it's, I think, a lot easier to apply that when you're building the infrastructure yourself. It's in the comparison of that apartment. One of my friends lives in this really nice luxury apartment complex in Boston. I'm super, super jealous. It's lovely. But one of the things they did is when they were building it, they built the security, the physical security of the apartment right in there. So all the doors have little key codes. And it's so much easier to do that while you're building the infrastructure, to just add the security portions there, as opposed to then going back and saying, okay, we built the house. Now we have to find a locksmith. The locksmith's got to find the right locks that can fit the doors. We've got to make sure it's accessible to all the employees. And again, it being, sometimes an afterthought in today's world, that's very costly, right? And it's very costly to look at security as an afterthought. And a lot of times when we meet with customers, it's in sometimes unfortunate circumstances where they have suffered, a serious attack. And, that's another challenge, I think, with security too, is it's not a revenue generating source for most companies, right? Security is, sometimes it's a sunk cost. And so a lot of times when you're, different companies that are out there, they tend to not focus on it because it's not going to necessarily make them money. But if you do have it, it will save you money in the long term once it's there.
Right. So how does Carbon Black play into this? How can Carbon Black help?
Yeah, definitely. So I think going back to that analogy of when you're building that infrastructure, right? A lot of infrastructure is being built with VMware right now. It's you see VMware and almost all the customers I speak with are using. I think we have an 85% share of the virtualization market right now. So as you're designing those virtual infrastructures, protecting your workloads and having Carbon Black as a part of that. So when you're building it and you're spinning up these new VMs, having Carbon Black's next generation antivirus security and the EDR components built right into that as you're spinning new instances, as well as, if you're adopting more of a cloud philosophy and you're moving to, a lot of folks are moving over to AWS through VMC, we can still protect applications that are running on AWS. So that way, say somebody gets a project and they need to spin up some new infrastructure and they need to get some resources spun up for some new folks to join or start this project. When that IT administrator is going through or whoever's tasked with building that, with VMware, what you're able to do is actually have the security built in as you're spinning up that infrastructure. So whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, you have that peace of mind that the security controls are already in place of that. So the communication of Carbon Black's security information into, helping connect those security teams with those infrastructure teams to really, create that dynamic approach where they're both able to go in and have that connectivity of, hey, this is the data we're seeing from Carbon Black. These are the vulnerabilities that are out there, and then adjusting Carbon Black's policies to help address those. Where it's really helpful to just get that. Starting with this baseline assessment, going through, hey, what's most pertinent to us? What are the vulnerabilities that we need to fix right now? And then going in, and once you have that understanding, Carbon Black has these very granular, customizable policies within its console. And so what's really nice about that is one of the analogies I always give is, when you're dialing a thermostat, you don't set your thermostat to low, medium, or hot. You adjust it to the exact temperature that you want. So by doing those vulnerability assessments, by running some queries to understand, where are we at right now, you're able to then synchronize the IT teams that's focused on those vulnerabilities, help prioritize the ones that are most important, and then you can set your policies to match those and create some synergy between both of those teams. Where a lot of companies, we do see, a little bit sometimes the security team wants one thing and the IT team wants a different team, but, creating that synergy between both of them. And then lastly, in that analogy too of that, I look at this and when I picture it, I think of a full circle here because, security never stops and it's always repeating itself. You need to constantly apply it. But going into, first getting that vulnerability, first getting that understanding of, things that you need to fix, setting the policies, and then going through and detecting and responding to those. And that really goes back to that foundational story of Carbon Black and their long history within the EDR market, where we're able to give such detailed context into how and why what's happening. We're able to provide unfiltered data. So you're able to see in a very easy way to digest the attack chains of what's happening within your environment. So you no longer have to question, hey, how and why did this happen? How did they get in here? Right? You can go through, you can see it, you can isolate the incident, and then you can surgically remove it, and then go back and repeat that full cycle, but making it very easy for everybody to understand and respond. And when you do that, it eliminates so much downtime for end users where, we have to first find the attacker that's in there. We have to isolate it. We have to figure it out. And then by the time they fix it, they're already back in. But by being able to, quarantine and surgically really remove what's happening, then they can, and then update the policy so it doesn't happen again. They put them in a much, much better position and really, really mitigate a lot of risk there.
Well, you mentioned the, that unfiltered data for an Ingram Micro partner or reseller that hears that, for their customer that maybe needs help with setting all of this stuff up. We know that we're stretched thin as much as possible. So, having that expertise may be a challenge for some partners or resellers. How can VMware help with that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of different components. And so I talked earlier about how, the fundamental design of the EDR product and, giving that full visibility. And so since then, one of the things that we've done is for customers who, don't necessarily have a dedicated SOC team that's already pre-built out, we have software that's been designed to be a really easy replacement to what they're currently using for antivirus at the moment. And so that software also provides, advanced ransomware prevention. It's blocking, the known bad files that are out there. And with the ransomware prevention, what it does is it actually looks at how applications are behaving with one another. So it's sending this constant heartbeat up to the VMware Carbon Black cloud. And we're looking and we're analyzing, hey, this application is working with this application. And so what a lot of attackers do right now is they'll use a trusted application that they know is good. So we'll take Excel and PowerShell are always two examples. And also in addition to that, Outlook as well too. 3 very common applications between almost every company that we run into. But a good analogy here is somebody opens up or a good example of this would be somebody opening up an Outlook email. It has an Excel document attached to it, and it's a phishing attack. But the end user doesn't know that. The bad guys have used some form of social engineering, and they're figuring out how can we get this guy to click on this email. And they send, purchase order to a salesperson. Most salespeople are going to open up the purchase order. And so that does happen, right? And they're a little bit click happy, and they click into that faulty purchase order. What it'll then do is then reach out to PowerShell, another trusted, known good application. So a lot of legacy antiviruses have a really difficult time blocking and detecting that because they're using trusted applications. But with that constant heartbeat to the cloud, what we're able to do is understand, how those applications should be behaving. When we detect that malicious behavior happening within a sequence of each other, then we're able to, help apply prevention there. So that goes into the ransomware prevention. But sorry, I kind of teetered off there from your original question. But what we've done with that unfiltered data is we've also added a tool into that tool we call now Carbon Black Standard to take the data that we would get from our enterprise EDR tool and make it really easy for end users to use. So that's the first option there is if you're first making that switch, starting with kind of I call it a crawl, walk, run approach, where you're starting with the more basic package that's out there, Carbon Black Standard. It's a really easy uplift. It's something that you already know and do with antivirus. However, you're getting those additional capabilities with that constant heartbeat. But then we have this EDR tool that's pre-built into Carbon Black Standard that it was built off of that original enterprise EDR tool, which has been called Carbon Black Response or Carbon Black Threat Hunter. And it's designed to be much easier to use for smaller companies that are out there. So they, don't have necessarily the resources or fully built out SOC team to do that. It's a very easy shift. Now, the next portion, right, you go into the groups that, hey, maybe they do have a SOC. Maybe they have, somebody that's dedicated to security 24/7. And that tool is super helpful for those people and helps them do their job and automates things for them and makes their life a lot easier by giving that really granular context. And then for groups that want that tool, that don't have the resources for it, there's a couple of different options too. The first is Carbon Black offers a managed detection and response service. So it's an extra set of eyes on glass that are constantly reviewing your environment. They're able to go in if they see a bad behavior, they'll go in, you'll have a human there. So if it's Christmas Eve, you're with your family, something goes awry, they quarantine the endpoint for you. You come back in, you're having your Monday morning cup of coffee. They say, hey, we detected this suspicious behavior. This is, what we found. This is what we think is happening. And then it opens up a two-way chat with a Carbon Black individual. And then the next option beyond that is using a full-blown managed services security provider, which Carbon Black partners with thousands that are out there. We have great relationships with our MSSP partners. And so that's kind of those groups are also able to help with things like microsegmentation, SIM. Each kind of has their own unique approach to the market, but depending on what's best for a customer, if it makes sense, we can help align them with one of the managed security services partners that we're already working with. And so from there, they're getting, additional things like the 24/7 support that partners are able to then take on support tickets for them. And sometimes we have groups that are out there that don't even need to look at their Carbon Black console because they've completely outsourced it. So in that example, you're able to, if you have a small shop that's out there, say in a rural area, and you need the security there, but you can't retain staff. We run into that pretty frequently, where it's really difficult. Sometimes the security market is limited in terms of employee personnel. And so they'll hire somebody, they have them, they get them up and running, they work there for a year or two, and then they say, hey, say they're in the middle of Pennsylvania, and they say, hey, we want to move to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia because, there's better salaries out there for security professionals. So we run into companies that frequently have that problem, but then by passing things over and syncing with one of our MSSPs, they're able to basically, they don't have to worry about the cost of hiring, onboarding, and dealing with all those different things. And so we have a very strong partner network that's out there. So if that's something, the final analogy I'll leave with you with all of that is if using Carbon Black yourself is one, we have a 1.5 out there as well too with our MDR service that's in-house. And then additionally to that, you have a 2 by using a full-blown MSSP provider, which then goes back to that crawl, walk, run analogy. So, whatever challenges a customer is facing, we have different packages to help them, ease the burden of making a shift to a next generation antivirus, of using EDR tools and getting access to all of those things that they need. We have different ways that we can approach it. So if you're already, advanced at this, we have a package for you. If there's things that you're first learning how to do, and you're kind of dipping your toes in it, we have resources to help with that. So wherever you fall in that crawl, walk, run scale, there's a package that we can help to consult with.
Excellent. Well, as we do start to wrap up our episode, we always ask our guests the same final question, and that's, where do you see technology going in the next year? So within this space, or if you wanted to widen that, where do you see technology taking place where's it going in the next year?
It's crazy to think. And I really think the biggest, in the 7 years that I've worked in security, I think it's all the things that have been identified have just continued to grow. And I think the need for security is just going to continue to expand, where, we're going to face the same challenges of working from home, of expanding to the cloud. But I really think that those things and the need for security is going to continue to affect groups. We're still seeing a lot of folks out there that are being affected by ransomware. I think that's constantly going to be a threat. So it's hard to say, how the bad guys are going to shift in terms of how they're attacking us. But I think those methods are still going to continue for the next couple of years, and security is still going to need to be incredibly prevalent. I think where I see it going is, going back to what I mentioned earlier, is groups like VMware that are able to help, build security from this very start is going to be a key component. It's back to that housing analogy. It's just like you see with any big city with all the big new fancy apartment complexes that come in with all the cool bells and whistles built in. I think more customers and more people are going to see the value of having a security solution that's built in when they're building their infrastructure from the ground up, making sure that security is a part of the conversation from the very beginning. And that's a trend that we're seeing. And I think it's only going to continue to grow in the next year.
Great. Well, for listeners who have a question about anything that we talked about today, or want to reach out, how can they find out more information?
Yeah. Again, Will Berardelli. If you guys need to reach me, my email address is wberardelli, WBERARD as in dog, ELLI, at VMware.com. Feel free to shoot me a note there. You can also reach out to Ingram Micro, has a ton of great resources that are out there that can help you get connected with individual Carbon Black reps. They also have personnel available that's, already knows Carbon Black. They have engineers that are trained and can give demonstrations on that as well too. And, feel free to reach out to your VMware core reps. We're all available here. We all want to help all of our customers, and we want to create, a secure world free of cyber threats. So if you guys need any of that, feel free to reach out to, me directly, to your Carbon Black specialist, your VMware core rep, or, your Ingram Micro specialist as well too.
Excellent. Well, that does it for this episode. Will, I appreciate all the time and the insight today. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shelby. Really appreciated the conversation, and thanks for setting this out.
Yeah. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. If you like this episode or have a question, please join the discussion on Twitter with the hashtag B2B Tech Talk. Until next time, I'm Shelby Skrhak.
You've been listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. This episode was sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. B2B Tech Talk is a joint production with Sweetfish Media and Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro production handled by Laura Burton and Christine Fan. To not miss an episode, subscribe today on your favorite podcast platform.